Marry me,
Marry me,
Amara,
Amara.
the little boy whispered, his eyes wide and earnest. He fumbled with a small, glowing plastic ring he'd clearly pulled from a cereal box.
Will you
will
please
you
marry me,
please
Miss
marry
Amara?
me, Miss
Oh,
Amara?
sweetie,
He
that's
corrected
so
himself
sweet.
with a shy, gap-toothed grin. Amara Reed was currently crouched behind a stack of industrial-sized flour sacks in the restaurant's dim pantry, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was hiding from the heavy footsteps of two men in leather jackets, debt collectors sent by an ex who refused to let her go. She looked at the boy, Leo, and felt a strange surge of warmth amidst her terror. She let out a breathless, shaky laugh and ruffled his hair. "If I marry you," she whispered jokingly, "will you make the bad guys go away?" Leo's face lit up with a terrifyingly confident intensity. "Yes," he said firmly, "my daddy is the king of soul. He never lets anyone touch what belongs to us." Amara smiled, thinking it was just a child's game of pretend, totally unaware that this playful promise would drag her out of the shadows and directly into the path of Choi Tae-hyun, the most ruthless, wealthiest mafia CEO Korea had ever known. If you're just joining us, please like and subscribe for more stories of hidden power and fated love. Now, let's see how a waitress became a queen. Amara had been wiping down tables at the Lotus Diner, just like any other Tuesday. She was a woman who prided herself on being invisible, a survival skill she'd perfected since moving to Korea. But she knew the sound of a storm coming. It started with the roar of a motorcycle outside, the signature of her past coming to collect. She knew how this played out, the intimidation, the shattered gloss, and the demand for the meager tips tucked inside her shoe. She had exactly 85,000 won saved for her flight home, and she wasn't giving it up today. She ducked into the pantry, hoping the manager would handle it, when a soft rustle came from between the shelves of takeout containers. The heavy silence of the Choi estate was far more terrifying than the shouting of the men at the diner. Amara stood in the center of a cavernous marble office, her waitress uniform stained with coffee and dust, looking like a broken bird in a cathedral. Across from her sat Choi Tae-hyun. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a storm that had decided to go still. His dark eyes tracked her every breath with a clinical, predatory focus. On the desk between them lay two things: a stock of photos showing the debt collectors being handled by men in black suits, and a thick vellum document with a gold seal. "My son doesn't make promises he can't make, Miss Reed," Tae-hyun began, his voice a low, melodic vibration that made the hair on her arms stand up. "He promised you protection. I am here to fulfill that debt." Amara swallowed hard, her hand instinctively touching the plastic ring still clutched in her pocket. "I was joking with him. He's just a child. I don't need a reward for being kind to a little boy." "Kindness is a rare currency in my world," Taeyeon said, leaning forward into the light. The sharp lines of his suit and the cold authority in his gaze made the air feel thin. "The men searching for you aren't just collectors. They sold your debt to people who don't care about money. They care about collateral. If you walk out of those gates tonight, you will be gone by morning. No police, no restaurant, no trace." Amara felt the cold truth of his words settle in her stomach. She had no one in Seoul, no backup, no shield. "And what is that?" she asked, nodding toward the paper. "The iron contract, a legal marriage of convenience for exactly 1 year. My son is the heir to an empire, and he is currently a target for those who think I am unfit to lead, because he has no mother figure to ground his public image. You provide the image, I provide the fortress." "A year?" Amara whispered, her voice trembling. "You want to buy me?" "I am offering you a trade," Taeyeon corrected, his expression unreadable. "Sign this and your debts are erased. Your family will never find you. You will have a name that makes even the most dangerous men in this country bow. Refuse, and you are back on the street in 5 minutes." He held out a fountain pen, its silver nib glinting under the chandelier. Amara looked at the door, then back at the man who held her life in his hands. The hyper-independence that had kept her alive for so long screamed at her to run, but the memory of Leo's small, hopeful face flashed in her mind. With a hand that shook only slightly, she reached for the pen. She wasn't just signing a contract, she was stepping into the dragon's den to escape the wolves. As her signature hit the paper, Taeyun stood, a faint, dangerous smile ghosting his lips. "Welcome to the family, Amara. Try not to regret it." The morning light in the Choi mansion didn't filter through grime-streaked windows like it did at the Lotus Diner. Instead, it poured through floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating a world of cold marble and silent corridors. Amara stood before a mahogany wardrobe, her fingers tracing the hem of a charcoal gray silk dress that cost more than she had earned in 3 years of waiting tables. The cotton waitress uniform she had worn for a lifetime was gone, replaced by a suit of armor designed to make her look like a woman who belonged at the side of a king. But as she adjusted the delicate gold clasp at her throat, the silence of the house began to feel heavier than the threats she had left behind. She found Leo in the West Wing, a section of the house that felt more like a museum than a home. He was sitting at a massive ebony table, surrounded by robotic kits and expensive tablets, but his small shoulders were hunched in a way that made Amara's heart ache. 2 silent, stone-faced tutors stood at the periphery, watching his every move like guards over a high-value asset. There were no finger paints here, no messy piles of toys, and certainly no laughter. "Leo?" she called out softly. The boy's head snapped up, and for a fleeting second, the future air mask slipped, revealing the lonely 7-year-old underneath. He scrambled out of his chair, but a sharp cough from one of the tutors made him freeze. He looked at the floor, his hands twisting the hem of his pristine sweater. "Good morning, Miss Amara," he said, his voice devoid of the playful spark from the pantry. Amara realized then that while Taeyun's wealth had bought her safety, it had bought Leo a gilded cage. Every inch of the boy's life was curated, monitored, and sterilized. He was being raised to be a weapon of the state, not a child. She looked at the tutors, her eyes flashing with a spark of the fire that once kept debt collectors at bay. "The lessons are over for an hour," she announced, her voice steady and echoing against the marble. "The prince and I have an appointment with a stock of pancakes and a game of hide-and-seek." The tutors looked at each other, confused by this woman who wore silk like a queen but spoke like a rebel. Before they could protest, Amara reached out and took Leo's hand. His fingers were cold, but they gripped hers with a desperate, crushing strength. As she led him toward the sun-drenched gardens, she caught Taeyun watching them from the balcony above. He stood in the shadows, his expression as unreadable as granite, but Amara didn't look away. She realized that her contract wasn't just about providing a public image, it was about bringing a soul back into this beautiful, hollow prison. She had traded her uniform for silk, but she was still a woman who served. Only now, she was serving a revolution of the heart. The air inside the private underground chamber of the Shilla Hotel was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and unsaid threats. This was the Dragon's Table, a quarterly summit where the heads of the 5 dominant families met to divide the city's spoils. Amara felt the weight of the silk dress again, but this time it felt less like a costume and more like a tactical vest. Beside her, Taeyun sat with a terrifying stillness, his hand resting possessively on the back of her chair. He hadn't said a word since they entered, letting the silence of the other bosses grow loud and desperate. "So, Choi," rasped Boss Kang, a man whose face was a map of old scars and older grudges. He leaned forward, ignoring Taeyun, to stare directly at Amara. "You bring a waitress to the high table and tell us she's the future matriarch of the Choi Empire? We expected a strategic alliance, not a charity project." A ripple of cruel laughter moved around the table. Amara felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, the same look she'd gotten from arrogant customers at the diner. But here, the stakes weren't a missed tip, they were blood. She felt Taeyun's fingers tighten slightly on her chair, a silent signal that he was ready to end the meeting with violence if she faltered. Instead, Amara leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Kang's with a sharpness that silenced the room.
"You talk about strategy, Boss Kang," she said, her voice steady and echoing. "But your family's logistics in the southern docks have been leaking revenue for 3 quarters because you're still using couriers who can be bought by a bottle of soju. You think a strategic alliance with a local heiress would fix your bad math? Taeyun didn't choose me for my family name. He chose me because I've spent 10 years watching the world from the bottom, and I know exactly who is stealing from the till while you're busy looking at the ceiling." The room went deathly quiet. Taeyun's eyes flickered with a dark, prideful amusement. He hadn't told her those figures. She had simply been paying attention to the ledgers she'd found in his study while Leo was napping. "The girl has teeth," another boss muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "She has a name," Taeyun intervened, his voice a low, lethal warning that caused Kang to lean back. "And if any of you forget it again, you won't be invited back to this table. Amara isn't just a guest, she is the shadow you didn't see coming." As the meeting resumed, the tension remained, but the mockery was gone. Amara realized that the dragon's table was just another dining room, and she had spent her whole life learning how to manage unruly guests. She caught Taeyun's gaze for a split second, and for the first time, the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a genuine recognition. She was no longer just a shield for Leo, she was becoming a weapon in her own right.
The luxury of the Choi estate usually felt like a shield, but tonight the air inside the grand foyer felt tainted. Amara was heading to the kitchen to sneak a late-night snack for Leo when she heard a voice that made her blood turn to ice. It was a jagged, desperate sound, the voice of Marcus, the man whose gambling debts and heavy hands had chased her halfway across the globe. She stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway as she peered into Taehyun's private study. Marcus looked small and pathetic in the center of the room, his cheap leather jacket peeling, a stark contrast to the sharp obsidian lines of Taehyun's desk. He was waving a folder of old photos, Amara from her life back home, tired and bruised, thinking he held a winning hand. "I know her history, Choi," Marcus sneered, his voice trembling with a mix of greed and fear. "The queen of your empire is a runaway with nothing to her name. Give me 10 billion won, or these photos and her real identity go to the press by morning. Imagine the scandal. Korea's richest man married to a gutter rat." Taehyun didn't move. He sat with his hands folded beneath his chin, his face a mask of terrifying serenity. He didn't look at the photos. He looked at Marcus as if he were a microscopic organism under a lens. "You traveled quite a distance to threaten my family," Taehyun said, his voice a low melodic velvet that carried a lethal edge. "I'm a businessman," Marcus stammered, sensing the shift in the room. "I'm just looking for my fair share." "You aren't a businessman," Taehyun corrected softly. He stood up, and the sheer gravity of his presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "You are a ghost, and ghosts have a habit of disappearing." He didn't snap his fingers or raise his voice. He simply tapped a button on his desk. 4 men appeared from the recesses of the room, their movements as silent and synchronized as shadows. Amara watched, her breath hitched, as Taehyun walked around the desk. He stopped inches from Marcus, who had suddenly turned the color of ash. Taehyun reached out, gently took the folder from Marcus's shaking hands, and tossed it into the fireplace without breaking eye contact. "You think her past is a weakness," Taehyun whispered. "Her past is why she is stronger than any woman I have ever met. You, however, are a liability. My men will escort you to the harbor. You will be given a choice, a one-way ticket to a place where I never have to hear your name again, or a permanent residence beneath the pier. Choose wisely." As Marcus was dragged out, sobbing and pleading, Taehyun turned his head toward the hallway. "You can come out now, Amara." She stepped into the light, her heart racing. He didn't ask her why she was hiding. He simply walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch wasn't cold. It was the heavy, unbreakable weight of a man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. "He won't return," Taehyun promised. "The ghosts are gone. You are the only one who remains." The following Sunday, the sterile silence of the Choi mansion was broken by the rhythmic thumping of a soccer ball.
Amara had traded her silk for denim, her hair tied back in a messy bun as she stood in the manicured lawn. Leo was breathless, his cheeks flushed with a vibrant pink that no expensive tablet or tutor had ever provided. A few yards away, Taehyun stood on the terrace, his hands deep in his pockets, watching them with a wary detachment of a man observing a foreign ritual.
"You're overthinking the trajectory, Taehyun," Amara called out, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "He doesn't need a physics lecture. He needs a teammate." Taehyun descended the stone steps slowly, his movements stiff. "I provided the equipment and the space. My role is to ensure he has the resources to succeed." "No," Amara countered, stepping closer until she was within his personal space, the scent of grass and sunshine clashing with his expensive cologne. "Your role is to be the person he wants to tell about his goal. Look at him." She pointed to Leo, who was hovering 10 feet away, clutching the ball and looking at his father with a mixture of hope and habituated fear. "He doesn't want your resources, he wants your time." She nudged the ball toward Taehyun's polished leather shoes. The Mafia CEO looked down at the toy as if it were a live grenade. "I don't play," he said flatly. "Then learn," Amara challenged, a playful but firm glint in her eyes, "unless the great Choi Taehyun is afraid of a 7-year-old. A flicker of something, humanity, or perhaps just competitive pride ignited in Taehyun's dark eyes. He loosened his tie and tossed it onto a nearby stone bench. He didn't kick the ball perfectly. In fact, he stumbled slightly, his form awkward and untrained. Leo let out a shocked musical giggle, the sound echoing through the garden like a bell. For the next hour, the Iron CEO disappeared. There was only a father trying to keep up with the son who was suddenly fast and fearless. Amara sat on the grass, watching as Taehyun eventually caught Leo, lifting him into the air. The boy's laughter was unrestrained, and for the first time, Taehyun's smile wasn't a tactical weapon, it was a genuine reflection of the boy in his arms. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Taehyun walked over to Amara. He was disheveled, his shirt damp with sweat, looking more powerful in his disarray than he ever had in his armor. He looked at Leo, who was collapsed happily on the grass, then back at Amara. "I spent millions trying to secure his future," Taehyun whispered, his voice thick with a new realization. "I never realized I was starving his present." He reached out, his fingers grazing Amara's cheek, no longer a mafia king commanding a subject, but a man thanking the woman who had brought his house to life. "You are a dangerous woman, Amara Reed. You're making me feel things I had buried long ago." The Grand Soul Charity Gala was a sea of shimmering sequins and sharp tuxedos, but beneath the surface, Amara could feel the current of danger. She stood at Taehyun's side, her hand resting on the sleeve of his black suit, feeling the tension in his muscles. Leo was a few feet away, being charmed by a diplomat's wife, but Taehyun's eyes never strayed far from his son. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne, a perfume that suddenly soured as the massive crystal chandeliers above them flickered and died. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, the refined murmur of the elite was replaced by the sharp, metallic clack of weapons being drawn. "Get down!" Taehyun's voice cut through the air, no longer a CEO's command, but a soldier's instinct. He threw his arm around Amara, forcing her toward the floor just as a burst of suppressed gunfire shattered the champagne tower behind them. Glass rained down like diamond shards in the dark. Amara's heart lunged into her throat. "Leo!" she screamed. Through the chaos and the shouting, she saw a shadow lunging toward the boy. Before she could move, Taehyun was a blur of lethal motion. He intercepted the attacker with a brutal efficiency that left Amara breathless, his movements precise and unforgiving. He scooped Leo into his arms with one hand and gripped Amara's wrist with the other, pulling them toward a service exit as more shadows closed in. The transition from luxury to survival was instantaneous. They burst through the heavy steel doors into the cold night air, where 3 black SUVs were already idling, their engines growling like beasts. Tires screeched as they tore through the city streets, leaving the flashing blue lights of the police far behind. Leo was trembling in Amara's lap, his small hands clutching her silk dress, but he wasn't crying. He looked at her with wide, trusting eyes that broke her heart. "Where are we going?" she whispered, watching the neon lights of Seoul blur into the dark silhouette of the mountains. "To the only place they can't find us," Taehyun replied. His face was splattered with a drop of blood that he wiped away with a chillingly calm hand. "The safe house in Gangwon. The Shadow Board has officially declared war. From this moment on, the world thinks we've vanished." As the car wound higher into the mist-covered peaks, Amara looked out the rear window. The life of a waitress felt like a distant dream, a different lifetime. She was no longer just a woman in a contract. She was a witness to a blood feud. She looked at Taehyun, whose gaze was fixed on the road ahead, dark and iron-willed. She realized that the safety he had promised her came at a price she was only beginning to understand. They were no longer just a fake family. They were survivors in a world that wanted them dead. The safe house was a fortress of cedar and glass tucked away in the jagged embrace of the Serak Mountains. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, the only sound was the crackle of a dying fire in the hearth. Leo had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep in the loft above, leaving Amara and Taehyun alone in the amber glow of the living room. For the first time since the pantry, the Iron CEO looked human. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of a jagged scar that crept up from his chest toward his collarbone. Amara sat on the rug, a mug of tea warming her hands, watching him stare into the flames. The silence between them wasn't the cold, pressurized quiet of the mansion. It was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. "You didn't have to stay," Taehyun said, his voice barely a whisper. "The contract has a force majeure clause. You could have taken the money and vanished after the gala. My men would have protected your exit." Amara looked up, her gaze steady. "I didn't stay for the contract, Taehyun, and I didn't stay for the money. I stayed for the boy who asked me to be his mommy, and for the man who was too afraid to ask for help himself." Taehyun turned his head, and for the first time, the predatory mask was gone. His eyes were bright with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "Do you know how I got this?" he asked, gesturing to the scar on his neck. "My own father put it there. To him, I wasn't a son, a successor. Every wound was a lesson in strength. I built this empire so no one could ever touch me again. But in the process, I turned into the same monster I was hiding from." He looked at his hands, the same hands that had been so lethal at the gala. "Until you. You look at me and you don't see a CEO or a mafia king. You just see a man, and that is the most terrifying thing I have ever faced." Amara set her tea aside and moved closer, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the scar. He didn't flinch. His skin was warm, and his heart was thundering beneath her fingertips. "You aren't a monster, Taehyun. Monsters don't love their sons the way you love Leo, and monsters don't look at me the way you're looking at me right now." The distance between them evaporated in a heartbeat. When he kissed her, it wasn't the cold, calculated move of a man in control. It was desperate, a drowning man reaching for the shore. The fake marriage, the legal vellum, and the billion-won deals vanished into the mountain mist. In the quiet of the safe house, there was no more acting. The waitress and the king had found a common language in the dark, and for the first time in her life, Amara wasn't just safe, she was home. The peace of the mountain safe house was shattered not by a storm, but by the shrill, persistent ring of Taehyun's encrypted phone. The color drained from his face as he listened, his knuckles turning white. A leak. His own cousin, the one man who managed the family's digital footprint, had sold the safe house coordinates to the Shadow Board. But the betrayal cut deeper. The perimeter had already been breached. Amara ran toward Leo's room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but the door was ajar, the window smashed inward. The small wooden dragon Leo had been playing with lay snapped in half on the rug. He was gone. The silence that followed was more violent than any gunshot. They have him, Taeyeon said, his voice a jagged edge of ice and fury. He was already pulling a heavy tactical vest over his black shirt, his movements mechanical and cold. Outside, the roar of engines signaled the arrival of his recovery team. I'm going to the docks. My cousin set the meeting there. Amara, stay here. My men will guard the perimeter until I return with him. No, Amara said, her voice cutting through his command with a steel he hadn't heard before. She wasn't the trembling waitress from the pantry anymore. She was wearing the silk of the Choi family, but her eyes held the fire of a woman who had survived the streets. You're going into an ambush, Taeyeon. Your cousin knows your tactics. He knows your men, but he doesn't know me. To them, I'm just the waitress, a liability. That makes me your only ghost. Taeyeon grabbed her shoulders, his gaze desperate. It's a war zone, Amara. I cannot lose you both. You won't. She stepped into his space, her hand grounding him. Leo is my son in every way that matters. If you leave me behind, I'll find a way there myself. Don't waste time arguing with a woman who has nothing left to lose. Taeyeon searched her eyes and saw the unbreakable resolve that had drawn him to her from the start. He didn't waste another second. He handed her a compact communication earpiece and a sleek black ceramic blade. Then we go together. But stay behind me. If anything happens, nothing is going to happen to us, she promised, her voice a low, lethal vow. As they sprinted toward the waiting black SUV, the transformation was complete. The fake family had been forged in the fire of the safe house, and now they were a unified force. The Shadow Board thought they were kidnapping a child to break a king, but they had no idea they'd just provoked a queen. As the car tore down the mountain path toward the city, Amara felt the hyper-independence of her past merge with the lethal power of her present. She wasn't hiding behind the counter anymore. She was coming for her son. The industrial docks of Incheon were silent once more, the echoes of the confrontation swallowed by the mist of the Yellow Sea. The Shadow Board's coup had collapsed not just through Taeyeon's precision, but through Amara's fearless intuition. She had been the one to navigate the maze of shipping containers, finding Leo before a single shot was fired, proving that a waitress's ability to read a room was as lethal as a soldier's aim. 6 months later, the atmosphere of Seoul had shifted. The name Amara Reed was no longer whispered with curiosity. It was spoken with a reverence that bordered on fear. She stood on the balcony of the Choi penthouse, the city lights below resembling a carpet of fallen stars. She was dressed in deep emerald velvet, her posture regal, the hyper-independence of her past now refined into the steady composure of a woman who held the keys to the city. Taeyeon stepped out from the shadows of the suite, his presence no longer cold or distant. He watched her for a moment, marveling at the transformation. He wasn't just looking at his wife, he was looking at his partner, the only person capable of balancing the scales of his dark empire. Leo ran past them, his laughter vibrant and healthy, chasing a golden retriever through the sprawling living room. The gilded cage had finally become a home. Leo's asking if we can go back to the Lotus Diner for lunch tomorrow, Taeyeon said, his voice warm as he reached for Amara's hand. He says the pancakes at home are too perfect. He misses the ones you used to burn slightly. Amara laughed, a sound that carried no trace of the terror she had felt in that pantry. I think I can manage to burn a few for the prince. Taeyeon turned her to face him, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. He reached into his pocket and produced a velvet box. Inside sat a diamond that seemed to capture all the light of the Seoul skyline, a flawless emerald-cut stone that spoke of permanence and power. The plastic ring was a promise my son made to save you, Taeyeon whispered, sliding the heavy band onto her finger. This one is the promise I make to keep you, not as a contract, not as a secret, but as the queen of everything I own. As he kissed her, Amara felt the final ghost of her past vanish. She was no longer the girl hiding behind flour sacks or the waitress counting won in her socks. She was the matriarch of the new empire, a woman who had walked through the fire of the underworld and come out gilded. Below them, the city hummed with the rhythm of their name. The fake marriage had ended, and in its place an unbreakable dynasty had begun, one built on a child's joke, a woman's courage, and a king's surrender.